Now we're going to get down to the nitty-gritty of what Indians are all about.
I still say we Indian people are believers in the truth. This is the way of life that was given to your people. You're born an Indian, you're going to die an Indian. Indianness is a good life. You're facing an Indian this afternoon.
Told him, son, never trust a man who speaks with a forked tongue. He will smile, shake your hand, he will lie and take your land. He is one you'll never understand.
Two buses filled with members from the Seminole tribe of Florida are beginning a journey back in time to relive a moment that occurred 160 years ago. It is a bitingly cold January morning. The bite comes from the mist produced by thousands of acres of water that cover Florida, and from the salt ocean that enfolds this Egan Fashke, or pointed land, as the Mishkoge Seminoles think of it. To the Migishoge Seminoles, it's Ichibolan, the nose of the deer. The convoy begins at the Hollywood Reservation, an urban res on the west edge of metropolitan Fort Lauderdale. They will continue west along Florida's I-75, called Alligator Alley, and then northward into the Big Cypress and along the western shore of Lake Okeechobee to Brighton Reservation. At each of these stops, the Seminoles will be joined by relatives from Immokalee and Tampa reservations, several hours to the east and north, and from along the Tamiami Trail southward. There are 5 reservations in all in South Florida, crisscrossing the peninsula from Atlantic to Gulf. Seminoles have come from all of them to be a part of the historic commemoration that is going to take place in Charleston Harbor at the tiny 19th century fortification called Fort Moultrie. It was there that 200 of their ancestors were taken as prisoners early in 1838. And it was there that one of the most famous of all Seminole war leaders, known to the outside world as Osceola, ended his fight forever.
The celebration part of this whole entire trip is the fact that the people who fought and died there in Florida and who went to Fort Moultrie as prisoners were fighting to keep their people in Florida. The people who are on these buses are the descendants of those Seminoles, and they remained in Florida. And their success is being symbolized by this trip.
When I get up there, I want to see everything that I can and absorb as much as I can about what's written and just get a knowledgeable information so I can bring it back and share it with the kids.
I just would like to go up there and see the people who made it all possible for me to grow up where I've grown up and listen to all the different stories that have a tribute to my tribe and my people.
To understand the profound nature of this trip, we must revisit a time and series of events that were without a doubt the defining moment in the modern history of the Seminole people. The time is 160 years ago today, and the events that took place then marked the climax of a war that had been straggling on for almost 2 years and would drag on for 5 more. Known in white man's history as the Second Seminole War, it was really the final chapter in the titanic physical clash of cultures that had begun over 300 years before with the entry of the first Europeans into North America. Once, many years ago, the ancestors of the Seminoles, the Mishkoget peoples of Florida and the Southeast, numbered in the hundreds of thousands and had villages and towns across the land. These ancestors would be the first to meet the Europeans and feel the pressure of their demands for land, for natural resources, and for the very minds and hearts and lives of the people. Seminole tradition says that the foreigners were white because they were made from the foam of the ocean's waves that cast them up upon the shores. And once the foreigners, the Spaniards, had found this land, during their Pascua Florida, or Easter season, they named it Florida. From that day to this, the foreigners have never ceased to come and to demand more and more of the Seminole people. But despite everything that the Spaniards and the English, and later the white Americans could do, the ancestors fought back and denied them total control of the land. By the early 1800s, in the time of their grandmothers' grandmothers, the government of the new United States was trying to push the Spaniards out of Florida and use the Indians as a means to keep their rivals out. Some of the Mishkoget tribes to the north could no longer stand the pressure and rose up against the white settlers. Other tribal factions sided with the white government, lured by false promises of peace at war's end. But they were tricked. Despite the promises of General Andrew Jackson, the tribes of the Southeast would be forced away from their lands. Thousands would go southward into Spanish Florida to join their Seminole kin. In Tillashit, a Mishkoget town in central Alabama, a 10-year-old boy known to whites as Billy Powell began to migrate southward with his family. Osceola, as he would be known to history, saw his town and his home and his entire family shattered forever by the war with the whites.
Following the disastrous Creek War of 1813-14, Osceola's family was fragmented and began to move southward. His grandfather, James McQueen, an Englishman, had recently died, according to his own reports, at 128 years of age. And Osceola's uncles, including Peter McQueen and others, had been among the instigators of the Creek War in Alabama. And so the family began to move southward, looking for some place where they could find peace. Osceola's grandmother and his mother, Polly, were among those from the town who moved southward. William Powell, Osceola's father, who was a white man, an English merchant, moved southward along with 2 daughters by a previous marriage. Somewhere around the point that we would now call the Florida, Georgia, Alabama conjunction, they split up, and William Powell decided to go to the west. At least one of his daughters decided to stay here in Florida, and Osceola's grandmother and mother and he, the 10-year-old boy, moved southward into Florida.
The stage was being set for the final conflicts between whites and Indians in the Southeast, even though they would take almost half a century to play out. Jackson soon followed the Mishkoget people, many of whom the white Americans called by the generic name Creeks, regardless of their actual tribes. Illegally, he pursued them into Spanish Florida, where he hunted their leaders and burned the towns of their Migishuget and Seminole kin as well. Neither the Indians nor the British nor the Spaniards could stop him. By 1821, the Spaniards gave up Florida for the last time and let the United States take over. Soon, the trickle of American settlers became a stream, and the stream became a flood. The U.S. government asked the Seminoles for treaties to restrict their lands and keep them out of the way of the new settlers, but they were just meaningless pieces of paper with more false promises. The settlers wanted not only the Indians' towns and their hunting lands, but their cattle and pigs as well. The U.S. government also wanted the Seminoles to give up the runaway slaves who had been taking refuge under the protection of Indian villages. However, the lands that the United States offered in return were too wet to build towns on, too small to hunt on, and too poor to farm. And most of the Indians were determined not to give up the slaves who served not only as farmers, but also as military allies. However, after General Jackson, the Indian fighter, became President Jackson of the United States, the U.S. Congress passed the Indian Removal Act in 1830, giving itself the official power to use military force to tear the Seminole people and all of their cultural kinfolk out of their ancient homelands. At Payne's Landing on the St. Johns River 2 years later, U.S. agents tried once again to get the Indian people of Florida to agree to leave their homes. Some of the Indians, weary of fighting and running, left for Arkansas Territory, a land far enough away that, once again, white men promised to leave them alone. but most declared their determination to resist removal with their very lives. For the ambitious and intelligent Osceola, the turning point came in the summer of 1835. The U.S. Indian agent Wiley Thompson had earlier recognized Osceola's potential and tried to buy his loyalty with gifts. But now, in the sweltering heat of the Florida summer, their tempers flared, and Osceola ordered the white interloper out of his land. Thompson, insulted by what he saw as the Indians' insolence, ordered the young man arrested and held in chains. To the proud and fiercely determined Osceola, it was the last straw. He told the agent what he wanted to hear in order to gain his release, but his heart was set on vengeance. Late in November and December of 1835, the Indian resistance leaders planned and executed a daring series of preemptive strikes. Designed to demonstrate their military power to resist the U.S., Philip, Alligator, Coacoochee, Jumper, and their trusted war leaders, including the young warrior Osceola, now 31 years old, fanned out across the peninsula to attack their targets. Osceola's first task was to execute one of their own. The War Council decreed that Charlie Amethla must die, for he had agreed to the Treaty of Removal. This execution served as a severe warning to other Indians with similar ideas. Then, on December 18th, Osceola led his party in a successful attack on a military wagon train on the North Florida prairie. Other Indian warriors attacked the white settlements on the east coast, including the large plantation owned by John Von Bulow. These attacks instilled new fears in the hearts of white settlers. 3 days after Christmas, the resistance leaders, Alligator, Jumper, and Coacoochee, were stalking Major Francis Dade's command, 108 soldiers, trudging up the Fort King Road from Tampa. Before the night was over, Dade and all but 2 of those men would be dead. At the same time, at Fort King, near present-day Ocala, Osceola would kill the government agent Thompson. The nation would be electrified by the audacity of the Seminole Indians. But their strategy worked too well. The Seminoles thought that their hard-hitting attacks would prove their military power and end the white government's oppression. But the U.S. took their actions as a direct challenge, and the war began in earnest. Throughout 1836 and 1837, the forces of the U.S. military pursued the Seminoles through the thickets, forests, and swamps of Florida's vast interior. Volunteers, both black and white, men of every nationality, regular soldiers and officers, grizzled veterans and young graduates straight from West Point, endured the scorching heat and privations in search of an enemy who struck and melted away like the pounding late summer rains. Osceola's image was enlarged with every battle and soldier's letter home. He was intelligent, handsome, an elegant dresser, and an eloquent and passionate speaker. In the eyes of U.S. citizens, many of whom sympathized with the plight of the Indians, he quickly became the symbol of everything that the Seminoles were fighting for. For almost 2 years, Osceola and the Florida resistance fighters hid out in the swamps and hammocks of the interior, constantly on the move to avoid capture. It became impossible to trust anyone, Indian or slave, because at any moment they might be captured and forced, at gunpoint, to betray the hiding places of the rest. Mothers were terrified lest a baby should cry out and give away their positions.
I used to listen to my grandmother when she used to tell me that during the wars, when her grandparents and her parents were fighting, that they used to hide babies and stuff cloth in their mouth because they would cry so that the soldiers and everybody couldn't hear them, and they would have to leave children behind.
More than any of the others, the soldiers focused on Osceola, and each time he eluded them, his fame grew larger. But even as his fame grew, his health and his following diminished. White soldiers were dying every day from dysentery and malaria, and the Indians, though much more able to deal with the Florida climate, were not immune to disease. Even as the daring warrior fought the white soldiers throughout 1836 and 1837, he began to suffer bouts of malarial fevers that slowly sapped his strength. 4 military commanders came and went, their reputations tarnished by their lack of success in subduing the wily Seminoles, while national public opinion divided and raged around them. U.S. citizens began to question the tactics of their military, asking whether a nation that purported to be as great and honorable as the United States could treat any foe the way the Seminoles were being treated. Osceola became the living symbol of all that was most noble and most tragic about the plight of the American Indians. But to General Thomas Jessup, Osceola was no noble hero. He was a poisonous reptile, and Jessup was determined to draw the fangs of the reptile, no matter how he had to do it. His opportunity occurred on a crisp, chilly day in the early fall of 1837. Just a few weeks earlier, Jessup's soldiers had captured Philip and Micanopy, the hereditary leaders who were so important to the resistance, along with the fierce warrior Kawakachit, or Wildcat, and more than 80 of their warriors. Osceola sent word to Jessup that he wanted to parley. Jessup was sure that Osceola was coming to ask for Philip's release. But Jessup was determined to capture Osceola as well, so he devised a trap. Osceola and Coayajo approached the white soldiers who were waiting for them about 7 miles south of St. Augustine at a tiny stockade called Fort Peyton. The Indians carried a white cloth tied to a slender pole, the universal sign of truce. They talked for a short while with the commander of the soldiers, General Joseph Hernandez, and then the officer slyly raised his hat. It was a prearranged signal. The soldiers closed in around the Indians and took them prisoner. In great sadness, they were marched northward to the mighty Fort Marion at St. Augustine. It was October 21st, 1837, and it was the beginning of the end of Osceola's short and brilliant career. General Jessup, who had ordered the capture of Osceola, would pay for the rest of his life for his ignoble betrayal of the flag of truce. It would haunt him publicly for the rest of his life. And his motives in the capture of Osceola continue to spark controversy even now. Within a few weeks, 237 Indian prisoners were crowded into the old Spanish fort on the bay. The weather was turning cold, and the dampness was setting in. The bite of the salt water ached in tired bones. Philip, Micanopy, Wildcat, and Osceola took counsel. The war could not be allowed to end, and one of them must be out there to lead the other warriors. Wildcat was the strongest and had the best chance of uniting them to continue their efforts. He would make the escape. The moon was barely a silvery new sliver on the night of November 29, 1837. For 4 days, the Indians had feigned sickness, and a few had been allowed outside the fort, under guard, to search for herbs to make medicine. The white soldiers had no idea what kind of medicine they were making.
Quite a few of the Seminoles were imprisoned here, and a majority of them were imprisoned inside the room where you can see the window directly here, where the escape was supposed to have been made from. And that would have been Cowacachi and Thomas Hadjo, according to Cowacachi himself. But according to the official military records, 18 others did escape with those, including 2 of those being female.
Wildcat, who loved to tell a good tale, especially to the gullible white people, later told reporters that the Indians had tied strips of their bedding together and climbed out through the narrow gun-port slit high up in the wall of their room. But the memory of their escape from the old Spanish fort on that dark, cold night has been preserved differently by the Seminoles. Many say that the prisoners escaped by making powerful war medicine and enveloping themselves in a fog so they could march right out through the Sallyport gate past the dazed white soldiers.
He was told by his grandfather that some of the Seminoles that were still on the grounds that were not captured they came to the fort and they dug the holes in the wall and they climbed to the window, and then they had special medicine to be done so that the bars can be loosened. So that's how they made their escape. And a long time ago, as these were written by non-Indian, the story has changed over the years, and that he's always been told that to keep the truth and to keep it going and to keep it alive, and his dad died, or his grandpa died in 1931, and that he died at 136 years old. So he remembers the stories as they were being told, and that he was told to keep the story alive.
Osceola chose not to go. He told his captors that he could have just as easily as the others. But his wives and at least one child were with him, and one of his wives may have been pregnant. Osceola was sick, and he knew that his time of fighting was over. 15 of his people ultimately would die in St. Augustine as a measles epidemic struck the overcrowded fort. But Osceola hung on. Captain Pitcairn Morrison decided to move his charges to a drier and more secure location. On New Year's Day, 1838, a small guard escorted the prisoners from aboard the United States steamship Poinsett to the empty little Fort Moultrie on Sullivan's Island in the harbor at Charleston, South Carolina. Accompanying them were Captain Pitcairn Morrison and a small guard, and the contract surgeon from St. Augustine, Dr. Frederick Whedon. Naturally fearful of being taken away from land on a white man's ship, they had asked Whedon to accompany them. The Indians had come to know the white medical doctor and his wife, Mary Wells Thompson Whedon, at St. Augustine, and they trusted him. The prisoners would remain at Fort Moultrie until ships could be arranged to transport them to Indian Territory in the West. Osceola and his newborn child would never leave.
All the Seminoles would have stayed within the officers' quarters or the enlisted men's barracks. One, there was no jail hill capable of holding that many people. Military stockades in those days were relatively small to hold miscreant soldiers who had been drunk on duty or done some other minor infraction of the military laws of the time. And so there was no way they could have held that many people within what we would think a jail, a prison type of operation. And plus, we know that at least Osceola was given the liberty of the fort, so he could go anywhere within the fort he wanted to go.
But for the next 30 days, Osceola and the other war leaders would be national celebrities. The War Department hired the famous Indian painter George Catlin to hurry to South Carolina to capture their likenesses on paper and canvas. Local sightseers crowded into boats and rowed out to the island to see firsthand these noble savages. Artists crowded the overheated rooms of the officers' quarters, eager to sketch and paint the prisoners, especially the famous Osceola. Today, the images that remain are tangible shreds of history for the Seminole people of Florida, who are still in their homelands because of the sacrifices of these ancestors.
We know that Osceola was not a chief, but we know that he was a very important man and a very intelligent person that fought for the Seminole people, and we would not be here if it hadn't been for him.
Many of the landmarks of Charleston were already established by the 1830s. Boys who dreamed of military glory in those days learned their trade at the already famous Citadel Military College. Now the hotel where innkeepers welcome road-weary Seminoles as their honored guests. Almost since the outbreak of the war, Charlestonians had been sending their sons to Florida to subdue the fierce Seminole warriors. Now, their descendants, living in a city still famed for its courtesy and hospitality, greet the Seminole visitors not as enemies, but as visiting dignitaries.
160 years ago, the Seminoles of Florida came here as prisoners, and there were over 200 of them held at Fort Moultrie. And during the time that they were here, the new Charleston Theater opened here in your city. The manager, undoubtedly thinking that the Seminoles are such an attraction that they would pull new viewers into his audience, decided to invite some of them to come to a production at the new Charleston Theater. And the play that they produced that night was called The Honeymoon by Thomas Becket.
A local resident who attended the performance, James Burchett Ransom, was moved to publish an account in verse of the exotic and touching moment.
The chandeliers sent forth a dazzling light, and splendid lamps and painting shone around. The scenery was superb, and all looked bright, while not one single seat could there be found. Then Osceola with his warriors came, a stern, unbending, stoic band they were, whose names, in truth, will long be known to fame for deeds of valor and for love of war. With earrings, trinkets, necklaces, and bands, heads decked with feathers, rings upon their hands, a group so wild, grotesque, and yet so sage, have very seldom looked upon the stage.
But the end of Osceola's life, if not his image, would come all too soon. A short 3 weeks later, he lay dying inside the same fort where his enemies had daily flocked to exclaim over him. Osceola was fighting the effects of malaria and recurring fever. But it was quinsy, an aggravated strep throat, that would prematurely end the life of the noble and passionate warrior. Ironically, it was Frederick Whedon, the doctor who attended Osceola at the end, who would in strange and unforeseen ways become an instrument of his immortality. At his death, Whedon took from Osceola not only his clothing and personal possessions, but even his head as a scientific specimen. Afraid to reveal a truth that would have destroyed his credibility with the Indians, Whedon told the world that Osceola had been buried in the Indian fashion, that is, with all of his possessions. But the body that was lowered into a shallow grave just outside of the Sallyport at Fort Moultrie on January 30th, 1838, was a naked, headless corpse. 160 years have passed since the city focused its attention on the Seminoles. No talk of war occupies the town today. Charleston is a town that sanctifies its history. For the Seminoles, too, the past is sacred, but they carry it with them every day. It is the Seminole people to whom these events are still fresh and alive as they retrace Osceola's final journey. Neither Seminoles nor Charlestonians are quite sure what to expect of this rare moment, but famed Charleston hospitality wins the day.
Now therefore it be resolved that the city of Charleston warmly welcomes the Seminole tribe of Florida. Signed, Joseph P. Raleigh, Jr., Mayor of the city of Charleston.
Osceola's historical reach would far exceed the short span of his life and even the terrible years of the Seminole Wars. His last wishes that his body should be returned to Florida, where his bones could rest in peace, went largely ignored. Certainly, it would be more than a century before his kinfolk in Florida would be in a position to exercise any kind of control over the question of his remains. But tradition requires that those remains should be whole and intact before Osceola can be returned to his Florida home. As for his spirit, the Seminole people do not believe that a spirit comes back once it has crossed over to the west, to the land where all spirits go. But perhaps Osceola's spirit has not yet gone away. Perhaps he continues to fight for his people as they in turn continue to remember and to honor him.